I would request people at the back to come forward if they want to. It'll be nice to make it warmer and cozier. I'm going to start by with a limerick. How many of you remember the limericks we learnt in school? Can I recite one for you? Yes. There was a young lady of Bengal who went to a fancy dress ball. She went just for fun, dressed up as a bun, and a dog ate her up in the hall. So limericks and Edward Lear, everyone knows the connection because nonsense rhymes was what we learnt when we were in school. But what I didn't know in great detail, I had a hint of it, was that Mr. Lear had an Indian connection, right? And that he was much more than just a nonsense rhyme writer. He was an artist. He had a passion. He had a mission in life. And to discuss that, I am going to ask Mr. Anindyo Roy, who's written this wonderful book, and the very well-known face of Gargi Rawat, to discuss the book and to find these facets, very little known facets of Mr. Edward Lear. On you go.
Thank you so much for that, Satya, and thank you for having me here at the festival, and I'm so excited to discuss this book, and I'm glad I got a chance to read it as well, because it talks about Edward Lear's years in India when he visited in 1874. Now, he was, as Satya said, he was a writer of the book of nonsense poetry, limericks. He was an illustrator. He was a very avid traveler. He's traveled everywhere all over the world. And he came to India at the Viceroy's request at the time to do a painting of the Kanchenjunga. And he went to Kurseong. That's where it began. And then, so he wrote about his travels and in this journal. And we're very lucky that Anindyo Roy came across this journal and was inspired to write this book, which is a fiction book. Anindyo Roy, Emeritus Associate Professor with Colby University in the US, somebody who's been writing, teaching, researching for over 30 years now. And this is his first book of fiction. So it's factual fiction all mixed together, which is very challenging to do, I have to tell you. So let's get into it. And right off the bat, Anindyo, you talk about how in your afterword in the book, you talk about how you got this journal of Edward Lear's, his travels in India, which again you weren't so aware about, and it just really stayed with you. And it obviously, and now today we have this book, The Viceroy's Artist. So what was it about that inspired you to write?
To be very honest,
it is.
It's on, right?
At this point.
To be very honest, well, first let me thank Khushwant Singh Literary Festival organizers for inviting me. I have to be honest, I really don't know what triggered it. What I know is that at some point I tried to write a scholarly piece on it, because as an academic I was trained to write scholarly articles, right? But I wasn't able to really move with it very much. So it kind of stayed deep within my unconscious, I guess. And during lockdown, of course, when everything, all action was suspended, it kind of brewed inside and came out in the form of the first draft. And also because I was very, very cynical about my own abilities to turn travel journals into a work of historical fiction, because it required not only historical research, but also certain skills of narrative, right? Because fiction has its own narrative form. But I could have been reflecting on it, and I think at some point it all came together and I started writing, and I couldn't stop writing once that process started.
And you've, you taught 19th century.
Yes.
So did that help you? Because again, fact and fiction, and it's very fascinating, the period when he came to India was in 1874, 16 years after the revolt of 1857, and his observations there also we'll get more into that going forward. But yes, so did that help you in writing this book, and how did you get over this challenge of combining fact and what he's written in his journals with some amount of fiction, fun, observations, and the narrative continues. Yes.
That was a challenge, because when you do historical scholarship, you are dealing with facts. You're dealing with what you retrieve from archives. And then you have a story to tell. And this story actually comes into being because when I was reading the journals are elliptical, fragments. He's telling a story and then he leaves it halfway. And you wonder, why didn't he tell us the full story? Or there were sections that were almost telegraphic. So I felt there was something residing within that needed to be told. And I thought the only way to do it is by employing fiction, by recreating those points, those events, and also giving names to unnamed characters, creating dialogues. That was the fiction part of it. The rest of it was based on the historical work that I did as a 19th century scholar on all of the other figures that were part of his life. Lord Alfred Tennyson was a good friend of his. He was also a tutor of Queen Victoria. He taught Queen Victoria how to draw. So there are all these very interesting incidents that are kind of historically locatable. So I had to somehow yoke those together within the form of the story. So
right, and it goes back and forth. He's in India, he travels, he goes to Kurseong, then he goes to Banaras, and talks about how dirty the river is, and not much has changed there, I have to tell you. And then he's in Kanpur, in Gwalior, Delhi, Kolkata. It's fascinating. Simla, he talks about that, and I want to talk about his observations about the Himalayas and development in the Himalayas. But when you spoke about some of the famous people that turn up in this book, and it goes back and forth. He's in India, and suddenly he'll remember something. Like if we talk about Queen Victoria, he suddenly remembers when he was tutoring Queen Victoria, and he saw some beautiful bowl, was it?
Yes.
Something, and he says, "Oh, this is so beautiful, and where did you get this from?" And she looks at him and she said, "I inherited it." Just deadpan.
Deadpan.
I mean, you can tell from the writing. Right. So, and also Maharaja Dalip Singh he talks about. So if you could just tell the audience about some of the famous characters. Tennyson, Victoria, Queen Victoria, and Maharaja Dalip Singh.
So, there is a particular narrative curve that one follows when describing travels. It's mostly linear. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and the end of a narrative, right? But somehow, I could not follow that particular linear form in writing the fiction. If I had to retrieve all the unspoken elements, I had to fall back on another narrative mode, which is going back to the past. And it's not in the form of like he remembered. It was in the form of sudden eruptions of memory. So he's looking at something in the present. He's looking at something in the present, and all of a sudden he remembers Queen Victoria. He's in Simla. He's sitting in a drawing room, and he looks at all the art objects and then remembers Queen Victoria. So this is the form that I adopt. A lot of early readers were a bit confused, partly because of that unstable narrative form, back and forth, back and forth. And the only signals I offer to help the reader navigate that kind of uneven narrative terrain is the past is always in a simple past, as if it's something that's happening right now. And those are the ways, and then it's italicized in the narrative. So when you see the italicized sections, that is not about the present. It's about something that is recalling from the past. So that's the narrative form that I use. And what I discovered is that, Lear was certainly commissioned to do a painting. and for which he received a lot of money. His entire itinerary was fixed by the Viceroy, who was Lord Northbrook, Thomas Baring, and he was very much conscious of the fact that he had a responsibility. So when he went to Kurseong initially to do the initial sketches, he's constantly troubled by the fact of whether he's able to get the scene right. And he is so troubled by it that he can't quite sketch. And what I wanted to also show is that some of his uncertainties about getting the scene right also mirrors his uncertainty about his place there as an Englishman who's arrived, you know, and suddenly asked to represent something which is in many ways unrepresentable, because the Kanchenjunga sections are sections about fluidity and change and the ungraspable. So I can read a section from that. This is at the beginning. Shall I
Yes,
do
of
that?
course,
It's
let's.
the very beginning. And it's in January, by the way.
And in fact, you talk about how a lot of his, people that he knew were asking, why do you have to go all the way there? Why do you have to go to India?
Exactly.
And he was an avid traveler, so clearly he wanted to go in, because he could have very easily just copied something. From a photograph, but he went, and he finds it very challenging. He also falls off his stool, but yes, talk about that.
Now, Edward Lear is 62 years of age when he travels to India. He's arthritic, asthmatic, and has suffered from epilepsy ever since he was 4 years of age. So this is not a very healthy man. He was also overweight, right?
And he was given to epileptic fits.
Fits. And one occurs right at the opening chapter. But this is Edward Lear as he's waiting for the Kanchenjunga to appear. He's sitting on an unstable, three-legged stool. So you can imagine a man who is overweight sitting on a three-legged stool trying to sketch the Kanchenjunga. The mist lingers as the two wait. Georgi stands erect at a distance behind Lear. Georgi is the Albanian servant who accompanied him during the travels. As soon as the first light touches the very tops of the pines, two peaks reveal themselves in the distance. The diffused light cast by the barely visible sun makes them look almost spectral. Sitting very still on his sketching tool, his second since he arrived in India, the portly Lear picks up a pencil and strains his body forward to get a better view. All he sees in front is an abyss, a boundless floating world filled with unknown eddies. His fingers are ready to trace the first line on the sheet of paper placed on a wooden stand in front. It is a decisive moment. As the shimmering slopes, the multiple points and precipices of the Kanchenjunga take shape before his eyes, the tip of his pencil begins to move, and very soon the lines begin to branch out steadily across the page. Now, as he is thinking about the form of the Kanchenjunga, out of the mists that sweep down from above, he sees the long, graceful form of Etna set against a few masses of rock and rough swirls of a river, the brown ink awash in the midst of clearly drawn strokes of pencil. So what I'm saying is that he's recalling an image of Mount Etna that he had done about 20 years ago as he's sitting to sketch the Kanchenjunga. And then, of course, he thinks about Mount Athos because he went to Greece. And then, all of a sudden, the broken up lines in front are slowly changing as the mountain range transforms itself into a ribbon of crumpled satin. Lear steadies himself and adjusts the horn steel-rimmed glasses that sit awkwardly on his bulbous nose. All around, the stiffness is almost palpable, and even the sound of cowbells that reach him from the forests below is quickly carried away by the cold gust of wind. So again, this scene has been literally kind of stretched deliberately to show the fact that he can't quite understand how to get the shape on the piece of paper. So that's one of the early moments. And this particular chapter ends with the moment where he falls. And but before he can get his mind back to the drawing, a strange, otherworldly ringing descending from the dark canopy of trees reaches his ears. Without warning, the sound begins to move with the gentle rhythm of the thin, liquid gold light that he saw moments ago pouring down silently through gaps in the foliage. At that very moment, his ears catch the call of a bird from above. A whistling thrush? A wren warbler? Or perhaps a laughing thrush? Or even a mountain starling? He isn't sure. Straining his left ear to catch the notes once again, he turns sharply on his stool. A drawn-out ringing that fills his ears is followed by a lull. The stool creaks, eyes throb, his body sways. And then, of course, we see him flat on the ground. This is his first epileptic fit that he experiences. Now, in the journals, he doesn't explicitly mention that he had such a fit. But he does have a little cross on that journal page. And scholars of Lear have said that he never actually ever describes, his falls. He used to signal it with a cross. A moment when he had that fall. So now I've obviously dramatized it, and I've kind of narrated it in this particular form.
And then when he feels depression, he calls it the morbids.
The morbids.
But as I said this, he was traveling 16, 17 years after 1857, and his observations are very interesting because everywhere he's going, he's being told about the horrors as well, and the heroes of, the brave British soldiers who, put the natives down and managed to overcome sieges and managed to save the women and children, etc., etc. But having said that, and I want to ask you how much of this is what you have, how you've interpreted it, because he's not fully sold with the way the British are looking at it, and he's somewhat sympathetic, I have to say, to the Indians as well. And it's very interesting to see, because otherwise it's through the eyes of the colonizers, and we've had a lot of sessions today talking about the British and India, but yes, tell us about that.
I wanted to portray Lear, because Lear was very unconventional in many ways. He lived in a Victorian era where he openly flouted ideas of proportion. If you look at his drawings, look at his verses, he categorically rejects that sensibility. So I said, how do I bring that awareness of Lear as this man who did all of that into his understanding of India and what he sees in India? Now, I didn't want him to either be an apologist for the empire or an open critic of the empire. And I wanted to portray a person who kind of moves between the two. At times, he is explicitly, Eurocentric. But at times, he is able to pierce through and get a few things that he's able to articulate. And that is, of course, my narrative intervention. And because there's not enough in the journal to be able to flesh it out as an argument if I were to write a scholarly piece, right? But as a fiction writer, I had the liberty to do that. And so there is the idea of the doubleness.
I'm going to ask you to read a bit about the Delhi chapter. But before that, when you were doing your research, when one does research, and a person like Edward Lear, it's so fascinating. And the fact that he traveled all over India. Tell us something that surprised you or really, excited you during your research.
What excited me was, first of all, he had a commission to do a painting of the Kanchenjunga, right? And he traveled through all of India, the length and breadth of India, spent 15 months, and he was actually going to spend another 6 months, and he had to go back because his manservant, Gargi, fell very ill when they were on a trip to Sri Lanka in Kandy. And so he hastily went back at the end of 15 months. But his plan was to spend close to 2 years traveling more. He was more interested in drawing because at this time he was sketching a lot, and many of his sketchbooks are, at the Harvard Houghton Library that I've looked at. He was also writing his journals. He was corresponding with his friends. That is one thing that struck me. And the other thing that struck me is a poem that we all read as a child. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. See, as a Bengali, we grew up with a lot of nonsense poetry because it's...
I was going to ask, that was going to be my next question, because you've dedicated the book to your mother. Who introduced him to nonsense poetry. And what is it called? Abol Tabol.
Abol Tabol. It's 100 years of Abol Tabol this year. So, was the Kamarband. That famous poem, Kamarband, was written when he was in Pune. I found that out from his journals, that he's composing this poem, and then he sends it off to Times of India. And then Times of India accepts it. And there he sees that weird poem out in print.
In the Times of India.
In the Times of India. And that was, for me, like, discovering something that I thought he had written perhaps straight out of his imagination, his weird imagination. But he was actually in India. And he was picking up Indian words and transforming Indian words. So there is a particular kind of linguistic wrestling with the reality of India that I find in the Kamarband.
Yeah, because wherever he travels, he meets these ladies, English ladies, and they're all talking about the dobis and complaining about the dobis and the khidmatgars and the khansamas. And, so he clearly picked up all this and put it in that poem.
That's right. So I can just read the opening line of the poem to just give you a sense of the resonances that
And this is something you studied later in school.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I studied it in school, and then, when I was taking classes and teaching courses on Victorian England and the Empire, that's when I became aware of it. And what I didn't know, of course, that it was composed during his travels in India. And the painting of the Kanchenjunga that he did, that is now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, was done in England based on the sketches that he did. It close to 35 sketches of the Kanchenjunga, but the oil work was done much later. But the Kamarband was written during his travels in India. So I'll just kind of give you a sense of the rhythm of it and how he's using the language form. All right. The Kamarband, it calls it an Indian poem. She sat upon her dobi to watch the evening star, and all the pankhas as they passed cried, "My, how fair you are." Around a bower with quivering leaves, the tall khansamas grew, and kidmatgars in wild festoons hung down from chotki's blue. He's inventing words. Below her home, the river rolled with soft melodious sound, where golden-finned chaprasis swam in myriads circling round. Above, on tallest trees remote, green ayahs perched alone, and all night long the musak moaned its melancholy tone. So this is just the first two stanzas, and it goes on. But the final one is, they said, hers was a dreadful fate. They nailed her dobi to the wall, where last her form was seen, and underneath they wrote these words, in yellow, blue, and green, "Beware, ye fair, be fair, beware, nor sit out late at night, lest horrid kamarbands should come and swallow you outright." And there's a whole tradition of, of Bengali poetry, of kind of cautionary poetry about the boundaries of behavior, what will be the repercussions if we don't obey. And it follows that rhythm also, beware, beware, beware. So I just find this poem very interesting in terms of his engagement with linguistic and poetical traditions as well.
And if we can read the Delhi bit, because
The Delhi
that I
bit.
found very fascinating of his travels in Delhi, and he has a little guide with him who
Yeah.
talks about the Great Fire, and then you realize and Delhi Nandu Lal, Nanku Lal.
Nankulal.
Yes, so that
He's
bit.
real, very
Yes,
real.
and Nankulal tells him about how Delhi under the Mughals was, incredible, and how today Delhi is not what it used to be, and the Great Fire came and burned down much of Delhi, and Kashmiri Gate is spoken about, and even tells him about Mirza Ghalib,
Yes.
and says he's a poet, and then Nankulal actually translates Mirza Ghalib's poetry, his and couplets and all, and gives it to him, which he then reads along
Yes,
the way.
yes. See, one of the things about Lear is that because he was so vulnerable physically, he was told that he would not survive. He was very much aware of his own mortality. I think in the Delhi sections, what I did was elaborate on that. His sense of his own mortality in relation to death and desolation, but narrated across his vision of a city in ruins. And that was my narrative intervention, if you will. He did see the ruins, he did see the blackened walls, the fallen ramparts. He was distressed by what he saw, and he didn't quite understand how a glorious city could lie in ruins. But he also realized that it was the English, who were responsible for that. And so his discovery of what had happened in Delhi during the so-called Sepoy Mutiny, the Great Mutiny of 1857, had to be narrated within that particular context of his own awareness of mortality, death, and desolation. So there are various places that he visits, and all he can think about is a city in ruins. It's not the grand buildings. And he looks around and he sees even the tombs around remind him of death. So that is the predominant image, the image of death in Delhi.
All right.
And Ghalib. And I think his discovery of some of the verses of Ghalib that, his guide
Nankulal.
translates, Nankulal translates for him, actually makes him aware of the poignancy, but also the horror of that particular period. Because Ghalib, more than any other poet of that period, represents the agony of Delhi. So that is what I brought together in my narrative.
And the theme of this festival, where we're talking about resilience and his observations about the hill stations, and he finds Landor very, very beautiful. He finds the mountains, the view from there even more beautiful than the Kanchenjunga. And
Yeah.
I'm from Dehradun, so I was a little like, okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting
Yeah.
to know about that. But at the same time, and tell me about if this is like his observations about how he doesn't like the fact that you're cutting the mountains, you're building
Yeah.
these hill stations. He at that time felt this was wrong, and you're cutting down these trees
Yeah.
and building, which everyone else appreciates. I mean, Landor and
Yeah.
Kurseong, and here we are.
That's
It's
right.
all very appreciated. But he had a different take, which I found very
Yeah.
interesting at the time.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, he saw all the monumental colonial buildings as really a way of destroying the real landscape. While others were kind of glorifying the empire, he actually, in several sections, he refers to some of those as the bungalow sensibility. He actually coins words because he was great at inventing words, like he uses the word melubious as opposed to melodious. He uses certain words to characterize this kind of architecture that he detests. And it goes kind of counter, because one would say we feel reassured to be set in an English kind of a landscape, like in Simla too. And in other places, he sees the destruction of the wilderness. He sees the efficiency that the British are bringing by building railways, but he's also aware of the fact that it comes at a cost. Yes.
And he's also a little he looks at all these English women walking on the mall road and, their big bonnets, and he describes
Yes.
them also as in not very flattering terms.
Yes. And that's where the satire comes in. There are elements in this novel where you see his perspective as opening into a kind of a satirical arena. So, for example, he visits a school in Simla, which was called the Punjab Girls' School, right? And so he asks the principal there, is it for, the daughters, the girls of Punjab? So the mistress,
nun, yes.
yeah, makes it say, local, but not native. Because there were lots of local English people who lived in Simla. They came up to Simla during, the summers, so their children went there. So, he's able to discern the difference in language between local and native. So a way of, I think, critiquing the so-called sensibility of the empire in many ways, yes.
That's right. I will open it up for questions if anyone has any. But the last bit where he finally, the Kanchenjunga comes to him in a dream.
Yeah.
And that is how he finally does draw it, if we can describe it.
You've got one reader.
Thank you. It's not working. Oh, right. Yeah.
Hello? Can you get this mic working?
No.
There's one there. Okay, I said he's got one reader. It's
You must read it.
fascinating,
It's very fascinating
Thank
to
you
see it
very
from
much.
his
And
eyes.
I resonate with what you said resonates with me, because I did something very similar. This is hard sell, okay? You can show Vionar 10 times, I can talk about my book once.
Of course.
My S.D. Burman book, I did exactly this. I fictionalized his life to make it more interesting. Yeah. So I know exactly what you did. But tell me, I have a question. Is that when you talk of satire and you talk about, making, finding faults with what was happening under the British, is it your understanding or is it his?
I got hints. As I said, in a travel journal, you cannot elaborate so much. Number one, you're traveling, so you have barely any time beyond what you can just hastily scribble at the end of the day. But I found in those scribblings certain inflections, certain tonal effects, where he was either criticizing the pretensions of the military commanders. There's an entire section set in Hyderabad where he's at the residency and he's appalled by the sensibility of the British commanders there, And so I picked up some of those patterns, and then I recreated other sections based on the consistency of those patterns.
Any questions?
Any more questions? Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Mike.
Yes.
Somebody give them a mic, please.
Oh, okay. Yes.
I wanted to know your own process of writing. How did you go about it? Thank you.
Oh God, that's hard to describe. Yeah, is it all right? Okay, hold it this way. The process involved coming up with a particular structure for the day. So I'm a morning person, so I would start by writing. I would briefly go over what I'd written the day before, and then say I've got to write 2 pages. So I'm kind of disciplined in that way. And then I would let those sections sit for some time, and I would work on another section of the novel. So I did a sketch of the overall narrative, and then I filled out each of those moments by doing, targeted writing, 2 paragraphs a day, and then fine-tune, go over, does this tone, is it appropriate? Choice of words. So it's not something I did right at the end, but it was like part of the process of refining as I moved with the narrative. I think the process of refinement also allowed me to get a sense of where I was moving. Because without that, I couldn't have moved to where I did.
Ma'am, you're writing your next book now, is it? Next, yes, your question?
Is the Kamarband is one of those famous limericks of the Lear, for which he was quite popular?
It's a famous nonsense poem. The limerick is 5 lines. A, B, C. I mean, that's the rhyming form. It's a very simple rhyming form, but the Kamarband isn't. Kamarband has 8 stanzas. And
So
it
it's a
was
very long
published.
poem.
It's
Yeah.
a long poem, published by the Times of India. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now this is your first fiction book, and I believe you're writing a second one, very different from this. If you could just
Yes,
tell us
very
a bit about that.
different. A very brief description of it. It's something that I started way back because I grew up in a small mining town in Western Orissa where my father was a doctor. And it was a time when it was a British mining company with a lot of English, mining engineers and others. And so as a child, we had a fantasy childhood. There were clubs and swimming pools and Christmas parties and picnics. But it was a tribal region. We were surrounded by indigenous peoples, the Oraos, the Mundas, and others. Somehow our lives intersected with them, but we never got to know who they really were. And so as you become older, these people come back to you through your unconscious. The memory of a face, of a conversation, of a situation. So I decided to write a story based not only on my memoirs, because I'm very suspicious of memoirs somehow. I think memoirs can be very self-indulgent. So I wanted to use the idea, the form of fiction, so that I could present my sense of growing up in that world, but also the perspectives of others who I acknowledge fleetingly growing up, but who become real in fiction to me, as real people with real stories. And these are brutal, hard stories of tribal displacement when the mines were first set up in the 50s.
Right. Well, talking about yes, go ahead. Talking about limericks, I just want you to read the Shimla limerick. It's very interesting. He's at this apothecary and he's buying toothpaste and it's supposed to be delivered, and the chemist is a fan of his, a young boy who's trying to write poetry himself. And in the evening, instead of 1 toothpaste, he sends 4.
Yes.
And then he composes this little limerick. And yes, then if we can get the mic to this gentleman, then the last question.
There was a young person of Simla who thought he had a magic formula of bottling potions with his wildest notions, that lovable young person of Simla.
Yes. Yes.
You see, I happen to read or remember 2 books. One is Delhi by Khushwant Singh, and another is written by 3 French authors, that is Freedom at Midnight. In both the books, what is fascinating in Khushwant Singh's Delhi book is he's describing the making of Delhi, and as if he's taking you through those various ages.
Yes.
And as far as Freedom at Midnight is concerned, they're narrating the incidents and happening and decisions as if they are happening in front of you. So how is your book different than these 2 books?
Well, number one, this is told from the perspective of Edward Lear. So it's a third-person narrative, but filtered through the consciousness of Lear. And I wanted to show him as being suddenly becoming aware of what that brutal history of Delhi is, but not completely understanding. After all, he is English, he is from the 19th century, and this is the first time he has heard about this brutal underside. Because when he was in England in 1957-58, during the siege of Lucknow, there were celebrations. He saw the celebrations. He remembers the celebrations in England. But when he comes to Delhi, and this is 1873, 16 years, he gets another different picture altogether. So I wanted to put the 2 together in his sensibility.
And that's just a small part of the
Yeah.
entire, his observations. But yes, it
Observations.
goes to Banaras and
And the other many other
Gwalior
places,
and
Gwalior as well.
little stop in Dholpur. I found that interesting with the young prince says hello in English or something like
Yes,
that.
absolutely.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, completely
Thank you.
out of time. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
very
this
much.
book.
Thank
And
you,
do
Gargi. Thank
you can
you
pick
very
this book
much.
up at the bookstore and have it signed as well by
Well,
Anindyo.
oh.
Thank you.
All right, this is your copy, Gargi.